In this episode, I sit down with Stuart McAllister to talk about foundational text for Christians who are interested in theology, sociology, philosophy, culture, living well basically as a Christian in our time. He gives a top 10 list of just broad categories that I think you'll find interesting. And somehow we end up weaving throughout the conversation all kinds of little nuggets and witticisms about reading in general, storing books, ebooks, paper books, organizing libraries, making notes in books as you go. So if you're a bit of a bookworm, you're really going to appreciate this episode. If you like what we're doing, remember you can follow along, share, subscribe, or donate to what we're doing by visiting www.toltogether.com. Thanks so much. Today, I am joined by Stuart McAllister to help us with a task that came in from a question from a listener. And so this comes from Caitlin in Pennsylvania. Caitlin is a friend. I've gotten to know her and her family. I've spoken at their church several times over the last few years, and so that's been a fun connection to have. But the question that she wrote in with, and we're not going to hit it exactly, but we'll get in the direction of it, would be for somebody wanting to lean into some kind of primary and first principle sources for kind of thinking theologically and philosophically about the time and era in which we live. And so we're not going to answer those in terms of, Socrates, Plato, that kind of thing, but look more at
Right.
some modern foundational thinkers, writers, text that would be useful in this time of just kind of like if you went through these, you'd have a pretty good foundation for attacking some of the ideas culturally, sociologically, philosophically that we see around us from a Christian perspective. And obviously, when I got that question, I was like, oh, we got to get Stuart to do this. Um, some of you probably have rows of books on your bookshelves. Stuart has rows of bookshelves in his base, like rooms. He has rooms of rows of bookshelves in his house. So that's why I'm like, yeah, I will get Stuart in here. He's somebody who's read more than anybody I know. I think I've told the story before. Stuart, you irritated me once. There was a book, I think it was from Baker. I forget who. I pre-ordered the book. So it was, I had the book in my hand like 2 days after it was released and then read it in like a day. And then I was like, "Oh, I got Stuart on this one." And I bumped into him. I was like, "Oh, I just read." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I read that last week." I was like, "Stuart, there's no way you could have read this book last week because I got it on pre-order." And he's like, "Oh, the author sent me an advance copy." So, my plan my plan was spoiled. So, uh, Stuart, as an autodidact, prodigious reader, very involved in the global church, well versed in the evangelical world and apologetics and the discipleship and the various ministries happening not just in the U.S. but particularly on the European scene, brings just a lot of wisdom and stability to thinking out loud in general. We don't often have him on the podcast, but I speak to him at least weekly, where he sorts me and Cameron out. So it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for being here, Stuart.
Glad to be with you.
Well, let's jump right into it. So this is Stuart, the list of Stuart McAllister. I think Cameron and I one time made a top 10 reasons we don't like top 10 list, but they're necessary
Yeah.
from time to time. So here they are, and this is not dictated from above. This is just out of Stuart's experience, him kind of giving a list of books that we might want to look at, and we'll post these titles as we go here. So if you're driving and listening and can't jot all this down, no worries. But the first one you have on the list, Stuart, is Modern Times by Paul Johnson. What can you give us by way of why a young person or a deeply thinking Christian should look at this book?
Well, some of this is written very much from my own historical experience. I was, ministering or beginning to reach out more and more to people in Europe. And a lot of the questions I found, they were asking questions I had no idea because I didn't know the historical context of some of the things that they were saying. Then I read this book by the historian Paul Johnson, which is really a history of the 20th century and the idea of relativism running throughout the 20th century from Einstein's development of the physics, how it morphed across into the sort of sociological and philosophical fields. That was not his intention at all. But as things often happen, ideas traveled. And so what I found is this was an enormously helpful book to me to try to get the historical context because Christianity doesn't drop out of thin air. It comes into a world in which, space, time, history, events, people, chemistry, physics, all of that matters and matters intensely. So what this did was to give in a lot of, if you like, the backdrop to the 20th century. And I think that was important because a lot of the changes that happened really occurred in the 19th, early to the 20th century, particularly in the anti-Christian movement, and so it became a very key book.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about listening to you speak and teach is you come across as one of the least surprised people by there are these ideas that pop up and we think that they're culturally new. And you're often saying, "Wait a second, if you look back and see the historical trajectory here, we shouldn't be surprised that we've come to this point in time." And so I think that's a strength that you bring. And so a book like this that gives us a little bit of that background, um, certainly is a helpful thing just to it's not that the gospel changes, but to just understand ourselves in time.
No.
Yeah,
Right.
that's
A lot of it's just to see is to understand the context a little bit more. Now it's a big book, it's several hundred pages, but that's the point. You can't get the result without doing the work. And you don't have to be an intellectual, you just have to be disciplined. But there is
mhm,
something about reading that opens your eyes to seeing things. So I think the role of discipline, a little bit of effort, and just chunk it. I mean, how do you read a 600-page book? Well, you read it a few pages at a time and it gets
yeah,
done.
yeah. Now, let's a little hiatus here. Do you how do you take notes when you're writing in a book like that? So say you have a copy of the Modern Times. Do you marginally scribble, underline, star, asterisks? What's your
Well, it's varied over time, Nathan, because some of it was my own sort of issues. So I had issues with wanting to keep my books pristine. So I had my books. Sometimes people said, you've never read it," and I had. It's just that I had opened it so gently and put it, and even the cover wasn't cracked. Now, while you're young and have maybe a robust memory, there was a certain advantage to that. Over time, really, what I did was I would underline and star passages. Sometimes I kept notes, or usually I had a file sometimes because I was a speaker. I would look and maybe had pages of like quote good quote on relativism and just pay the person and the page number, and I had that at a glance. Then if I was working on something, I would look and see if that was relevant and it would fit into a discussion or a talk or an illustration, and then I could keep it that way.
Yeah, so while you're reading the book also dictates a little bit of how you keep the notes on it. I think another thing, just to throw in a personal thing here, if you're reading a 600-page book, for me, yeah, I have my own kind of little nomenclature of, something I star might be a direct quote I want to use for something, or a, underline or a bracket or question mark or a little, like I'm not sure about that, quite, um,
Right.
but my goal is that I could pick that book up 4 years later and in about half an hour, kinda go back through my own highlights there and refresh my memory on that. But the other thing is, if you're reading a 600-page book and you're doing it a few pages at a time, it's helpful for me, because perhaps I don't have maybe the memory Cameron or somebody else does. It's helpful for me to just go back and look at the last few, like maybe the previous chapter or the previous paragraphs, just to jog my memory to get back
Yeah.
into the flow of the argument that's being made as we go around. So that's a yeah, good tip there from Stuart. Don't be afraid to go ahead and make a mark in it. Okay, so is this a so the background history there, Modern Times by Paul Johnson. The next one you have on the list here is The Passion of the Western Mind, by
Yeah.
Richard Tarnas. Is that a similar kind of
No, this is The Passion of the West. Yes, similar but different. This book grew out of a time when actually we were teaching an apologetic class in a seminary in New York. And again, a lot of the books tend to be, theological and philosophical work. And what this book was is kind of a history of the ideas, and it shows from the very early days, from the Greeks right through to the postmodern world. Probably one of the best condensations of the actual thought as it unfolded right through the Reformation, questions of the Trinity, written by a guy who's not a believer. But some of the transition period, particularly from the medieval to the modern world, some of the best stuff I've written. And I found the class equally used it. Good condensation of the ideas, good presentation, and again, a great bibliography. If you need to go to the primary sources, it was just a fabulous book, both in the sweep of where we have come from, but why we were in the kind of a moral and mental confusion that is so much of postmodern world today.
well, that's the trouble with a good book is that it points you to 5 other good books, and then those 5 good book point you to so be prepared. This,
Yeah.
list of 10 might turn into 512 by the end of this, but I think that's just a good practical reminder as you're reading books too of thinking of, like, I remember in high school, Stuart, "Oh, skip the introduction, don't read any of the footnotes, blow through it as fast as you can," but as you're wanting to really, um uh, saturate yourself in the ideas here. The footnotes and the introductory and the other stuff there really becomes an important part of understanding a whole family of ideas. And so that's a helpful thought. I was just as you were saying that by accident when I was an undergrad, I took a classical mind philosophy class, which was sort of a
Right.
blitz through history of classical thought, and I took an art history class at the same time. And this wasn't intended, but they progressed through history at about the same amount of time. And it was a really
Right.
a wonderful educational opportunity for me to look at the cultural manifestations of the ideas expressed in art.
Yes.
And so a book like
Well,
Passion of the Western Mind that can kind of show the actual materialization of the ideas is a real gift when somebody takes the time to build it.
funny you should say that, and of course, the very thing you alluded to. So, in parallel with that, at the time, there was a book by Jacques Barzon called From Dawn to Decadence, which was kind of an art history, and it did exactly that. And I remember exactly the same thing. You're looking at the philosophical, and then you're looking at Barzon's looking at all of the artists, including the modern era, of course, Beethoven and Brahms, and all of this, and the literary, and you see how the art and I mean, how these ideas take expression. So I think part of the reason I chose these books, Nathan, as we're going along, each of them was a turning point in my own thinking, a very formative in helping me to shape, trying to bring the gospel. Try to, is the gospel really true? Does it really answer the question? But also seeing these other thoughts and how they interacted. So it was very useful, and that book particularly was very helpful in that regard.
Well, so that's great. So we have Modern Times by Paul Johnson. We have The Passion of the Western Mind, and the third one here does take a decidedly theological shift. The Cross
Yeah.
of Christ by John Stott. And so this is a classic. But give us why has this become a classic?
Well, I think because I would say, I mean, and I'm not a theologian, but many people, pastors and leaders I've talked to, where people would say it's probably one of the best, if not the best book on the cross in the 20th century. And here's why. I mean, he was a pastor theologian, so he was very much in touch with the church, but his ability to bring the entire multiple ways in which the gospel is comes to us, or if you like, the four main primary metaphors of propitiation, justification, redemption, and so forth. He brings us so beautifully into play as you look at all of the texts, both from the gospels, but then in the epistles. I was on my way to I was in a van on the way to Eastern Poland as I was reading it, and I had messages and I'm sitting there, I'm going, "Oh, ow, oh, oh," and I couldn't help but try to bring it all into my preaching while I was in Eastern Poland at the time. And over the years, I read it 2 or 3 times, and every time I've gone back, I've been come almost taken away by the clarity. Now, there's a kind of technical language in it, but there's a simplicity and there's a
Mhm.
beauty. And it really is a key text. I think for anyone involved with as a true Christian, to get the idea of who is Jesus, what is the gospel, what is the love of God, and what is the grace of Christ. And I think Stott does a masterful job of making that the bedrock of which everything else has to anchor around.
Just one personal note on that. I mean, you come across books that there's this a spiritual component, the wisdom of a pastor coming through and the ability to
Yeah.
communicate, and I think this is one of those books that it's not just the words, there really is, a prayerful,
Mhm.
intentionality to the way that I think it's written that really, um, just something about the way that it reads, it just, speaks and connects a lot of dots that are kind of obviously there, but you need somebody to spell them out for you somehow, so that's a great one
Yeah,
to
look,
list.
there's a coherence in the mind and there's an engagement with the heart. And I mean, I think you sense that you're reading these words and you're having to think, but you're also worshiping. You really are seeing, you're moved to prayer. And some of the turns of, for some of his turns of phrase, there's sentences in that you could preach for weeks. But just as a person, just telling people, about the purpose of the atonement, the role of the nature of sin, the nature of the cross and what it achieves, what Jesus is and what the love of God means. It's just so beautifully elaborated, and he's a very eloquent and a very very gifted man.
I will say for me personally, the books that are more theological, you can't read them quickly. You
No,
you'll stick your finger in the page, you'll stare out the window, look at the wall. So you have to marinate on them as you go along. These aren't. But that practical question, Stuart, Like, do you read a book straight through, or do you have, like, a couple books going at any given time and kinda toe in and out of them?
I usually so I have 2 kind of things running parallel. If you look at my desk here, Nathan, you would laugh, but so I probably have about 4 or 5 on the go any one time, but really what I do is when a book really grabs my attention, like there's one I'm reading right now, I put the others on hold deliberately
Yeah, okay.
because I so want to give it my time, and there's some books of such importance when I pick them up. I feel I need to read this because there's an argument I need to grasp, and then, and especially as I got older, would read them 2 or 3 times because I realized that the first read I had only kinda skim read it, and need to
Yeah,
get it
right.
in a better grasp
Mhm.
of it.
Well, and I found too that there are books that I didn't have enough life experience to understand, and then
Yeah.
10 years later, maybe read them and thought, "Oh, wow, this really is." Maybe I read it because I thought somebody else wanted me to or whatever, and there's times to do that, but
Oh, that
yeah, I
that was
my death.
most of C.S. Lewis and me.
Right, yeah.
Didn't get on my taller in the early days, and years later, I thought, "Oh, good grief."
Well, my desk also is you can't really see it, but yeah, it's kinda like a buffet there where I snack on things, but then every once in a while, I have a hunger for something and can really bore into it. Um,
Yeah, I hear you.
the next one here, No God But God, Os Guinness and John Sear.
Yeah. Yeah, I picked that one deliberately because there are books that actually speak about the question of idolatry, but this was one of the early runs of Oz and John at a conference, and their essays on the whole issue of idolatry, and I think it's one of the really really simple but very best books. I mean, you can come up with Tim Keller's Counterfeit Gods, which is a great
Mhm.
version, but this one really helped me a lot to give a language and a clarity and a visibility to things. I think it was Moody Press that released it at the time, and just very, very profound clarity, not only on idolatry, but how idolatry works, talking about the transcendent idols, idols that are far away, if you like, the idols of something that pulls us out, and then idols close at hand. So he has this dynamic in the book that mentions that this kind of twofold dynamic that goes on in the idolatry process, and then how the gospel, of course, engages that with a God who is transcendent and immanent, yet relates to us through the power of the Spirit. So just a very, very good, very useful, I think, a very essential type of book, if not that one in that genre, that I think would be very helpful to anyone, both in pastoral work, evangelistic work, any work, because of the human heart factor and the mind. Why idols have the power and the intellectual grasp as well as the existential capture that they do in people's lives. So very useful. It was a very very useful book.
Are you indicating, Stuart, you don't think idolatry has gone away? You think that's still a relevant? Yeah, no. Very good.
I think
Alright.
we have an amplification of it through the internet. And
No, that's uh, No God But God by Os Guinness and John Seal.
yeah.
On to the next one. This is a book I've heard you quote, from many times, Colin Gutton's The One, the Three, and the Many.
Mhm.
Give us the
And
snapshot.
this is going to be a harder read for people because this was the Bampton like this was lectures that he gave in 1992, and basically Gunton was a theologian at I believe King's College in London, Anglican, and really looking at the theological battles for many years, but particularly the modern era where we had lost any public relevance of Christianity. In fact, many people felt it was past its sell by date. Gunton goes back and shows that the theological where we took a wrong turn in the road, and that the way to the future was to run and go back through the past and look at the church fathers and look at some of the early conceptions of the and how Trinitarian theology, rightly understood and rightly expressed, made a difference and answered most of the questions that the modern and now the postmodern world was asking, both in their respective ways. So I found it very useful because, again, having these other books I've mentioned, you went into the history, but the theological clarity with which he connected the very being of God, the very movement. I mean, in getting into words like perichoresis, hypostasis, and homoousios, or the circumcessio in the Latin and all this kind of thing.
Yeah, that doesn't work with
Marvelous. But
Scrabble, but a
you know,
good theological idea.
no, but you know what it's like. Sometimes these are words that bounce and people say, whatever. No, it's not whatever. These were very precise words used to capture something, to point us to a
Mhm.
profound reality at the heart of being. And I found that the relationality, the idea that God is one and three in many. So Christians have this theology and philosophy of unity in diversity in relationship. That's a huge thing.
Yeah.
That we can see the unity, the oneness of all, the diversity of all, but the relationships between all that makes the parts interact with the whole, and how that becomes an essential thing and is part of what the modern world, fragmented as it is, cannot find. It can't find unity, or if it finds unity, it can't find diversity, and it never knows how to relate the two things together. The Trinitarian theology does that, and because of who God is and the nature of the world in which we live in.
That's, so you quote a book, we're talking about a book here that was written in 92. So a good chunk of our listeners weren't born when this book was written. Um,
That's right.
but this is and actually, as I look at this list, there's nothing, I don't know what the most recent one would be here. These are, well, what I wanted the listener to understand here, it's not that they're dated, it's that they're foundational enough that they don't change with the whims of culture and politics and the surface level stuff. So by definition, when you're looking for foundational text or first or kind of links to primary sources, you're going to be reading older, deep thought stuff that in a way transcends because it underpins the ideas of the culture that you see around you. So never be never be scared by the copyright date on foundational text like this. So just
Yes, that was the idea of chronological snobbery was a thing that I suffered from a long time. I would tend to go for the newest writers, the homo up to datum, as Oz calls them, and, that was a real mistake because I didn't realize the value that sometimes someone earlier said the thing that's being said today better. Now, there are things that we have learned at the expanse of that's why it's important to add to from your thought, but sometimes the older voices say the thing with greater precision, with greater clarity, with greater honesty than a modern writer does. So I think it's getting the balance. And I chose these because I felt they were useful in that sense that these were voices. I could read them today, and with a few, sort of shakedown, a few phrases and whatever, large majority of what is said is totally relevant to this moment. That's why I think they're useful.
yeah, you picked an entire book list that doesn't probably mention Taylor Swift at all. So yeah.
No, no, she didn't get in there. It was
She did
I had
not.
to say she was dancing around somewhere in the background, but, hey.
Okay, so moving on to number 6, The Way of the Modern World by Craig Gay. How does that compare to Modern Times by Paul Johnson? What's the way of the modern world?
Oh, is very very different, and this book is a theological book and one of the more modern, although not when I say more modern, probably early 2000s, I think. It's basically a way that this writer in particular, who, in light with the kind of literature I've been mentioned here, noticed that in much of modern Christianity in the West, particularly, had become what he felt was a form of moral deism, or in many respects, practical atheism. In other words, they used the language of Christianity, but there was no spiritual power or real transcendent things in it. And his point was to look how the modern world socializes us and intellectually forms us into a form of lived and practical atheism. Now, it's an incredible book. I think it's one of the books I recommended to Cameron a number of years ago, and I know that it really lit a fire in him because today you see it so blatant. It's very well written. It's very well argued. I mean, again, the book is worth it. It's a library in itself for all the additional literature found within it. But his own writing is so clear in the way that Oz used to talk about the difference between people who would talk about modernism as an idea and modernity as a process. And I think that's the idea. Is the process is you've got to get that capture between the ideational world of communication and thought and cognitive versus the sociological world in which practices and habits are formed through advertising, music, song, lived reality that forms us into a type of practical atheism. So it's a very useful book. And again, comes back towards the last few chapters again with very a robust argument about the cross and Christ and the incarnation as the kind of John Stott type antidote to the modern sickness.
So we've looked at some theological, sociological, a bit historical and philosophical. All of these are going to have anthropological elements to them, but let's turn a bit more in that direction to the Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis.
Mhm.
I think I've heard you maybe in the last month just kind of sign as a like, well, this is this is coming to fruition. This is coming into fulfillment. Give us the quick
Mhm.
teaser here of why the Abolition of Man seems so um, on the nose in our time.
The Abolition of Man is probably for a small paperback book, is probably one of the greatest classics of all. Lewis, as a classical scholar, had looked at the basic view in which the goal of human life across time was to find happiness by pursuing the good. And so the long-term vision was to conform the soul to reality. But the modern world was a complete break in which the idea was to use reality to satisfy my desires. So one is really the sort of moral vision of reality based on a view of the universe and morality as an actually existing thing, natural law and so forth in the universe. The other is the materialist universe in which psychology is basically the way we manage our pursuit of happiness, consumerism, and all these kind of
Mm,
things. So the abolition of man and Lewis's idea, of course, where he talks about the way the head ruling the belly through the chest, and the chest where the heart is, but the supremacy of reason is such a crucial thing because we're in the age of the feeling dominated society. In fact, the very illustration that opens up the book is where we live, that feelings don't emotivism. I don't It's not that the beauty itself is something really existent in the universe. My feelings about something are what's important, not whether there's something that arouses that in the first place.
and
And so the abolition of man is a great read.
then just add 70 years of technological development on top of that, and voila.
Yeah,
Um, but I think
yeah.
this is the thing we talk a lot about on Thinking Out Loud and in our conversations together, Stuart, is the ability. There are plenty of podcasts and YouTube channels and articles on the latest, trend or outworking of some of these deep ideas. But when you're back into the mid 20th century here on something like the abolition of man, that's when you know that you're hitting the foundational things that resonate with actually core and deep concepts of what it means to be human when they have this timelessness to them.
Yes,
It's a
because
true
I would say
independent
that
idea. Yeah,
well, what Lewis does there, Lewis has that famous phrase, truth is always about something, reality is that about which truth is. So the abolition of man actually takes like books like The Passion of the Western Mind, and it's that book condensed, but it's why and what it has done and what has been achieved and what is missing. So again, these books, there's a synthesis. This is a putting together a symphony, and you're getting bit different pieces of the music. And this is an important piece to bring in so that you can hear the music playing together and the harmony to which it points and the coherence from which it comes.
there we go. The great composer Stuart McAllister putting together, or maybe we could say it's a bouquet. You're getting the diversity of the colors, and for those of you who
That's it.
imagine
Rich
that.
palette all blended together with
Yeah.
beautiful harmonization. Yeah.
All right, number 8, The Universe Next Door, James Sire.
Now, it's one of the classics. Was written James Sire wrote this again many years ago when he was working, I think, with InterVarsity, and InterVarsity Press published it, and it's gone through many editions. In fact, the latter edition was good because he updated again some of the postmodern critique of some of the things that he had said, or some things that he had perhaps missed about the embodied nature. But it's a fabulous book to get an overview of the different worldviews. I mean, in other words, that there are entire systemic ways of looking at reality. Marxism is a system, existentialism, humanism, Islam, Buddhism, and so forth. And what Sire does is to go through chapter by chapter, looking at your next door neighbor or your person in the coffee shop who's a Hindu or a Buddhist. They're living in a completely different conceived world than you are. And this is a descriptive map in a way. And then, of course, it shows the Christian view of reality. And there are other books you can add to this, but I think as a good guide to worldviews and to the breadth of thought and the differences, it's a very useful and a very essential book in the postmodern world. Just because our world is so we're watching television from Scandinavia, from around the world. We're listening to music from Korea, boy bands. Well, I know you are. I'm not, but
Ow! Did
and you
learn.
mentioned Taylor Swift.
I just learned about that for Cameron, so I'm putting that back on your family.
Oh, okay, well,
No.
yeah, I thought it would come from somewhere weird. But anyway, I think it's a very coherent view, and it's very systematic. So it's a very useful tool not the last word, but a very key part. And then thinking again about Christianity, how it touches all and answers the questions, addresses the same questions that these other views and philosophies are dealing with.
All right. Well, thank you for that one. And some other time we need to do a podcast on what you think the success and trajectory of actual postmodernism is and where we're at in relation to all that right now. But that's, I'll point to that rabbit trail, but we won't go down it. Number nine, as a good Presbyterian, I don't know about this one, Stuart. When God Became King by N.T. Wright.
Well, the reason I brought in there are many of his books, I think, which he's written for the church. He's also got these big theological tomes on the life, the trilogy on the life of Jesus, and of course the works of Paul. And there's a lot of, sure, people feel different views about N.T. Wright, but I think on his masterly approach to the Gospels, to the one Gospel, and the many pieces, particularly filling in, helping people to see how the Old Testament story leads to what actually happened in Jerusalem.
Mm,
And I think reading that, when you see what it means the word became flesh, what it means that Jesus is the Messiah, and see how all of these prophecies and these events and these locations have enormous significance, and just the sheer confusion that when Jesus came, that people, we think it's obvious that people would understand what he was saying. They didn't, and just as much as we don't either. We don't seem to be here, get the real Jesus at times. So I mentioned this one because it's important to think and keep all of our thoughts centered on, in, and from Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah,
mhm.
and what that means. And I think, again, this is a good book, goes a good run through the Gospels, and a great picture of looking at how Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the four evangelists in the time, and then with Pauline and other attributions in there too, to see how this composite picture of Jesus emerges out of this story, and how that story guides reality. And it's a very, very compelling picture, I think.
I think that is the strength of N.T. Wright is his ability to show the deep continuity in places where people have thought there's discontinuity in the biblical story. And not only is there continuity, but there's high resolution beauty oftentimes in some of these gaps that we've passed over. And so, regardless of what you think about them in other categories,
Sure.
it's a phenomenal amount of scholarly work here to kind of paint the box top to the puzzle in very high detail for us is a real gift.
And I'm sure you would say, and we would agree, that like theology and this isn't a pure exercise. We haven't got 100% untainted resources or 100% perfect or anything like that. And anybody who tries to say that, I think, is on a fool's errand. We see through a glass darkly, but we can see. We see in the context of the revealed scriptures given to us in a tradition, but even our tradition is quite diverse. And so we
Well,
listen to voices, ones that we weigh more heavily, that are closer to us, and ones from outside that still say things to us that are true, though we weigh them differently. And so I think all of these voices, some of these voices, a couple of them are not Christian voices, but they're valid voices for us to pay attention to as we try to understand reality and as we search for truth as the key.
mhm, mhm. Well, with that helpful statement there, let's use that to transition to a very Christian and interesting voice, The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society by Leslie Newbegin. Can you maybe it'd be helpful if you give a 30-second biography on
Yeah,
Leslie Newbegin before you go into this particular book?
sure. Well, the reason why the Newbigin is such an interesting character is this book was written after he had finished over 30 years of service in India, where he was a bishop in the Church of South India. But he spent a lot of his time actually in interfaith dialogues, witnessing, sharing, and trying to understand, the sheer complexity of Hinduism and its vast resources, but also bringing the gospel of Jesus in that context. It was also a time in the end of empire in Britain, changing the Anglican Church. And the Britain that he came back to from the mission field was a liberal, secular Britain, very, very different. And he found that trying to talk about the gospel in Britain was back in foreign territory, that many of the assumptions and the presuppositions had disappeared. People no longer either knew the language or and certainly did not believe the things that were normally taught through catechism or in church or in school at one time. So, but Newbigin, as a both as a churchman, but as a missiologist, began to look at Western culture, and he realized that there was a narrative in the West that he was denying there was. postmodernism said the narrative is there is no narrative, but he said there was clearly a narrative that there is no narrative. So they were telling us the narrative of no narrative, and in multiple narratives were dominating, and there was a forced control then of what was allowed to be said, definitions, and so forth. And so, what Newbigin, this book does is to look at pluralistic society, analyze it a little bit, and then come back with how the gospel engages by preaching a false gospel, maybe a modernized or overly systematic or absolute certainty had limited and crippled Christians in their communication. But by
Mhm.
truly understanding the gospel is Jesus and that God communicates himself by his spirit through his word by faith, and we trust that, he opens up how we can communicate what we need to say and ways in which we could engage more meaningfully. So, a very rich and a bit you have to put on your thinking cap with this one,
Oh, yeah.
but
I'm not all the way through
a
it.
very, very good book.
I'll confess it's in the pile over there, and I have part of it all marked up, but, haven't made it to the end yet, so, but yeah, very timely. I mean, how to live in a pluralistic society
That's it.
and how to be a faithful Christian in the midst of that. Yeah, that's a really
Yeah,
good.
indeed.
Okay, Stuart, this is a phenomenal gift that you've given here. Caitlin, if you read all of these and get back to me, let me know how this changed your life and for everybody else too. But just to, I think, throw this out there as the type of work that people are doing that have that people like Stuart have done. It's also, I think, when you listen to people speak who have read well, Stuart's just given us 150 hours of reading material here. Um, I think when you run into people who do this type of work, be sure to thank them for the time. Stuart, I've even, to best of my ability, when I finish a book that I like, try to find an email address and just send a note to the author and say, "Hey, you'll never meet me. I'll never meet you, but thank you so much
Mhm.
for, some of these are years and years worth of work that people have done the thinking to
Mhm.
kind of put these thoughts down and to present them. And that's just such a gift. So let's be thankful for people who write the books, for people who read the books, who people who
Yeah.
interpret and translate the books to us. Um, I'm just humbled and appreciative of people who it is work to play and learn in the world of ideas. And so let's practice gratitude there. Two quick thoughts before we go.
Amen.
What are your thoughts? Do you ever read anything on an ebook or electronically? Or are you a solely crack it open on paper?
Oh, no, I'm so that correct. Mary has been, she's read electronic books for a number of years, especially when we're traveling. I just never could get beyond paper. I just need the paper. I need the tangible, the tactile, and I like to flick through and I love the smell of books. And so, no, I'm not going to electronic. I'm not saying I understand people who do it for convenience and all kinds of other reasons, but for me, it's got to be paper.
Yeah, I think so. I differentiate between books that I just kind of need to read because people have been asking about or something, but I'm probably not going to return to
Mhm.
if I can get it,
Right.
99 cents on Kindle or a free one through the library. Fine, I'll read that on I have a paperweight. But then if it's a book that I'm going to teach out of, that I'm going to come back to, that I want to really sit undistractedly with, then I need to have that as a paper. So I think look at some of these as investments. Um, also you don't have to buy a new copy of every one of these. If you're a younger person, you're thinking, oh, this is a big list. Um, A books, thrift books. I mean, Google around a little bit, and oftentimes you can pick up a copy of some of these, you know, 3 or 4 bucks. And then other times you're going to say, you know what, this is a formative enough book. I'm going to buy the new copy of it from the publisher or from
Mhm.
directly from the author nowadays. And see that as a way of supporting their work and having something that I can use and learn from and share. And then the final impossible question. So you've got the books on your desk that you're reading. When you finish them, we've talked about this. How do you organize your books? How do you, so that you
Well,
can find them,
yeah.
you know, give us any, for
That's
the
what
readers out there, give us
that's
any
a
tips.
well, because the way my mind works, I tend to group 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 them by big categories. In other words, like I have a try and keep a shelf. This is all history. This is mainly philosophy. This is sociology, or this is whatever, or this is contemporary culture things. The problem is I've run out of space. I've been culling recently to create new space, so I've got a kind of a um, life in the church category at the moment that seems to have grown exponentially, and so I'm running out of space. But I need a big theme, a bucket, and at least I know the place I can rake through a little bit. But I mean, more ordered people. I've got friends who are have got their, their libraries tagged, and and you can do that now, of course, because of AI. You can take pictures of your shelf and get them grouped. Andy Bannister was recently showing us the way to do that, and I mean that would make sense.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a dinosaur, so I'm not quite in that world, but that is an option.
Yeah, I kind of have I can kind of remember what the binding of a book looks like, and so I, like, on this shelf, kinda have it grouped. Maybe I'll have my NT right in a theology, or maybe like a British, author kinda. So, it's a mess. I don't yeah, other than something super, digital, I don't.
Have to be a category that works with your mind, though. I think that's the key. I think it's like, it's like, how does a woman lay out a kitchen? I mean, I've been in many organized kitchens, but none of them are the same because every woman or every cook or every chef comes at it a particular way. So your library is the same thing. It's got to be your library, and therefore you have to have your kind of a master key to how you find it?
Well, I don't know what the right answer is, but whatever's going on my desk right now is not the answer, so pray for me.
Well,
Uh,
I mean, I think your wife said you ended up with goulash as your model, so I'm just not sure how that works, but there you go.
yeah. What's the old Erasmus quote? "When I have money, I buy books, and when I have extra money, I buy food." So there are those in the world yet, and Stewart is one of the masters. And um, for the sake of time, I think we'll wrap it up here. I'll post these titles along with the show notes here, so people will have access to them. But Stewart, thanks so much for your seriousness, and for the lighthearted way in which you can really approach things that I think are very helpful to older and particularly to us younger thinkers alike. And so, thank you for your mentorship, your friendship, and for modeling well the thrill of engaging in big ideas, and the avenues of beauty, and the way in which we can really worship the Lord with our mind through engaging this type of work. So, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope, and oftentimes reference books.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.